Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm delighted to be able to speak to all of you today. At Kroll, we are always looking to provide thoughtful insight and great value to our clients to help them defend their organization, but also defend them against the latest cyber threats and adversaries and improve their cyber maturity. My name is Ben Charles. I'll be kicking us off today with the introductions to this webinar before passing over to our main presenters today. But first, before we get started, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and will be available after the briefing. We're using GoToWebinar for this presentation, and you'll find the client on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time, and our presenters will be able to address questions from their end as well. So today, we will explore the key benefits of incorporating the surface, deep, and dark web intelligence into your threat detection and response strategy. During this session, we'll discuss the top use cases of digital risk protection and the best approaches to mapping out and reducing your digital exposure across all areas of the internet. So just a quick overview of who we are. Kroll Cyber carried out over 3,000 IR engagements in 2023. Kroll is in a unique position, therefore, to be able to deliver end-to-end cybersecurity solutions across different service lines, from proactive services to pen testing and offensive security services to managed detection and response services and incident response. We therefore have a wealth of experience with over 650 cybersecurity experts on the Kroll team who are working around the globe, the companies of all sizes and with a variety of industries. And we work with over 100 cyber insurance carriers. This therefore gives us a tremendous visibility into what's going on in the front lines. And we'll be using that to inform you on what we're seeing in the landscape today. In this section, we're going to cover, firstly, who our speakers are, and a bit about their background, but also what is digital risk exposure in terms of the challenges that customers are facing, that organizations are facing. We certainly have our views as a provider of digital risk protection and our wider cyber services in terms of what we're seeing. But we want to give that unbiased view as to what we're seeing in the industry, what you as security practitioners should be doing in terms of protecting your risk exposure. We'll then look at some recommended steps and a recommended approach that you can practically take to go and address this and utilize this as part of your security strategy. And we'll even walk through some example war stories and go through exactly what the benefit of utilizing some of these capabilities in line with your SOC strategy or your detection response strategy. So if we move to the next slide, I'll now do a quick intro into our speakers for today. We're joined by Wojcieszek, Global Head of Threat Intelligence at Cyber Risk, and Scott Hanson, Head of Security Architecture and Engineering and Cyber Risk within Kroll. Keith, firstly, is the Managing Director and Global Head of Threat Intelligence for Kroll. He has been working with Kroll for 6 years, and prior to which worked for various organizations, but also various agencies, including the US Security Service, where he led the Security Services Cyber Threat Intelligence Program for Kroll. So Keith will be talking through essentially aspects from his function in terms of what's being delivered to clients, but also where he's seen as a consumer and as a security practitioner, what are some of the risks out there and what are the practical steps that you can take. Scott Hanson will be our other presenter and speaker. Scott Hanson is Associate Managing Director and Head of Global Security Operations in the Cyber Risk function. He leverages more than a decade of experience in the enterprise information technology sector with significant expertise in endpoint detection and response technologies, SIM technologies, and other tools that are being used in the SOC and to be able to hunt for threats. His primary focus is helping clients through our Kroll services to enhance and restore network security through continuous threat detection, incident response, and forensics. Right, with that, I'll pass on to Keith to kick us off. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you so much for the intro, and I'm really lucky to be here with Scott, who leads the MDR service. So it's fantastic. So you guys are in for a good show here today. But for those that follow me, that listen to some of my webinars that we have, I always go day to day on what the day is today. So I have to say today is kind of cool because it's March 27th, 2024, and in this day in 1912, the cherry trees were planted by Helen Taft, which is the wife of the President Taft, and the wife of the Japanese ambassador in front of the Jefferson Memorial. Now, in 1934, D.C. began the tradition of sponsoring a three-day celebration, which is now known as the Cherry Blossom Festival. If anyone has come to D.C. during this time, it's absolutely gorgeous and beautiful out. But after World War II, because the trees were demolished by World War II, the U.S. actually sent a bunch of cherry trees back to Japan and to Tokyo Collection that were devastated and really be able to plan again so they could grow again. So kind of a little cool known fact for today. So let's get into why we're really here. So as we know, being a victim into any type of cyber incident is detrimental. It's horrible. But what we're going to talk about is DRP, digital risk exposure, and why do we need it? So we all know in order to be a victim of a cyber attack, some type of reconnaissance occurs. Even if it's an insider threat. Like any type of attack, cyber or others, there are warning signs. Preparing and having ways to identify them is a key element to success. A cyber attack doesn't start on a network. It actually comes from outside and then planned sometimes on the dark web, forums, hacking sites, other locations. So another one, every day in the news, you're hearing that some form of attack or data leak occurred. Identifying potential account takeovers or data leakage as early as possible before it causes some major damage, to include either reputational or regulatory, is vital. Now, when I was working undercover investigations in the government, the first thing I would do was attack or look at the exposure of individuals or even companies. Understanding the extent to which the company's sensitive data has been exposed can be very critical information. And it's the littlest things you can identify. So knowing what they are, really, you don't want to bury your head in the sand on this one. And finally, in our final block, what we're looking for is it flows right into perfectly your brand and identity monitoring. When is it going to be targeted or not? Impersonation, any type of what's going on with your company itself, what you may not be aware of is a really good way to increase that maturity. So looking on the next slide, ultimately everything we've just discussed, every company wants to know and put in place, but there are some challenges, right? It's not easy to identify the data. You need to have access into various locations on the internet. The expertise is extremely expensive, and understanding what you're collecting and being able to put it in some type of actionable takeaway is a skill set that's developed through years and years of experience. The term threat intelligence is very broad. Now, it's a key term nowadays. Everyone's saying it everywhere, but what does it truly mean? So when you're collecting all kinds of data, right now it's information. But how do you take the expertise and all this data to make it something actionable and make it a pure intelligence and have that return on investment? With relevant data that you sift through thousands and thousands of pieces of information to create that intelligence to mitigate properly. It's very difficult. And finally, threat actors are extremely sophisticated and knowledgeable. They are cutting edge and they are actually pioneers in the industry. Even though we don't want to recognize it, they truly are. They're coming up daily with new ways to avoid detection from law enforcement and anyone that feels risk to their enterprise. They're putting security features in place on their websites and doing all kinds of different things to make sure that they are secure. It's not as easy as signing into a site and say, boom, oh, there it is. There's my data. There's more that goes along to it. So these are some of the things, the challenges that we're seeing. So, on the next slide, with the companies, what is the dark web, right? We want to understand what it is. So on the right here, you're going to see the iceberg. I know we've probably seen this all over the place. Now, this isn't a proper representation of the divide dark web, surface web. I don't really have those stats specifically, but it gives you an idea, right? We're looking at the iceberg. The above is a surface web, which is most known to us, Index, Google, Yahoo, Bing, easy accessible. But under the surface is the deep and dark web, which there's much more. The way I like to think about it is it's all the internet. It's all typing ones and zeros. The difference is, my background is with the U.S. Secret Service. So I was in the White House a lot. So I kind of want to compare it to the White House, right? You go in, you have a lock and key to get in. Now that will simulate that to a computer. You can get into a house any way you can through a lock and key. Computer, you can get on the internet. Then there are rooms you can visit that are not locked. You can kind of just see what's going on. You have the public tours. You can walk in and see there, see here, and that's the surface web. Or you're just kind of browsing around TikTok, whatever Instagram you're doing. Then there are locked doors, a little higher security, where only particular members can get into. This would be the deep web, your bank accounts, stuff that's either permissions, paid behind a paywall, something it's not nefarious, but it's a lock and key. Then there are secret doors, secret tunnels, hideaways, passageways, one way to another. We all read about them in the books, right? But that is what simulates the dark web. Right? We're looking at places where only certain people know about, certain people know how to get in, whether it's a verbal password or it's a lock and key, or it's something very detailed in order to get in there, reputation and however it is. Those are the dark web places. Again, it's all one internet, but there's different locations where everything exists. So the key to all of this is that anyone can get access. They just need to know how and where to get it and the information needed. So it's not too complex if you think about it like a house. So how do you monitor for digital risk exposure? So on the next slide, if you first understand your risk appetite, we need to concentrate on that. Where do we sit? DRP, or digital risk exposure, is essential to address several concerns, as we talked about a couple minutes earlier. What the key elements for a successful program is taking a peek behind the curtain at the corporation to include the domains, email domains, intellectual property or IP, credentials, and even understanding the risk in using a particular software within your infrastructure. You have Citrix, Microsoft, all these have 0-day vulnerabilities, 1-day vulnerabilities. Understanding what exists in there and how that can be exposed is paramount in everything we're looking at here. So once you have the understanding, what do you do next? Well, creating a priority based upon your risk appetite, so you're able to start collecting. From open and closed sites, which is deep dark web, criminal marketplaces, threat actor blog sites where ransomware gangs post data, closed chat platforms, closed areas, encrypted channels, even code repository sites like GitHub. Can't tell you how many times we see some of these source codes that are exposed out there. Now, all of these collected will provide you with a holistic view of your exposure. But again, kind of what do we do with this? Well, now you start collect that data. It needs to be put in a location you can analyze and index it so you can search and make that investigation worthwhile. This is actually the most difficult part, and the experience and expertise comes into play here. So going through the tremendous amount of information, sometimes having to format it correctly, plucking out the intelligence that informs you to help make better decisions. You can go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole and continue to search, but are you really getting your value out of that? So there was a study, I was part of a program there was a study that conducted on all threat intelligence companies. And this, not even to anyone that does threat intelligence. And there's about 3,000 different companies that offer threat intelligence. Now, they all claim they have unique data. And you know what? They probably all are right. What they found was only 2% overlapped, which to me, I thought that was pretty tremendous, because this means that you actually need to enrich your data with different intelligence feeds, sources, and understanding what your risk appetite is, along with what is important to you, that will give you the most accurate and actionable intelligence alerts. So again, that is the key element to all of this circle here. But once you have all that data, you need to mature what your cyber awareness is, and that can make a difference. So alerting is the next step. While you're doing this, there are particular questions you need to have answered. Every time you're doing some type of a DRP or anything you're working on to create intelligence back to you, why am I doing this? Why am I alerting? Is this pertinent to our goal? Or what does this mean to me? Why should I even care about this alert? And what do I do to mitigate? If you can answer those 5 questions, it's extremely important to have that alert move forward. Now, these are crucial questions you need to address during the entire process and routinely ask yourselves over and over again. So with that, I'm going to give you guys a couple examples of what we've seen and what we've done. So there was a client who was in the real estate PE sector. They experienced a ransomware event, which thousands of people do a year, and the event resulting in encryption and exfiltration of sensitive information. So they're already going through probably the worst time combating with the threat actor, all of this stuff going on. What do we need to do? How do we stop this? They're very tunnel visioned into certain things. And what's going to happen to the company? What's going to happen to the data? What are the fees that we're going to incur through the investigation, the regulators knocking on our door? And what are we going to tell the public? Will this cause a massive reputational harm that cannot be reversed? We've seen this time and time again. So while the investigation was going on, we began to initiate, DRP, digital risk protection, looking at the dark web and ransomware sites for data exposure, chatter, mentions about the client. So as we approach it holistically, looking at it as a threat actor. So we identified the client appearing on an actor-controlled site, which we immediately notified the client. So we spoke with them, got approval. We began the download of the exposed data set and provided all the files to the client along with a summary of the data, the file listing, size, count, and other metadata related to the data set. So that was extremely beneficial to the client and to the investigators because they were unaware that the data was going to be exposed. The investigation was still being conducted and confirming what data was taken, looking at logs, and trying to identify what was being determined. This gave the client the visibility into the dark web, the ransomware activity, the retrieval of data, and then we virus scanned it, make sure there's nothing on there that would affect them later, and they got it back. The threat intel reports relating to the events, we were able to provide the actor ransomware group, any TTPs or anything that was associated with the technique of the threat actor, any kind of indicator of compromise, email address, IP address that was associated, and any risk mitigation that we could do immediately to help them get back whole. Although their data was already exposed, the retrieval of the files helped target the forensic search and prepare the next steps to reviewing the data and understanding how they were going to tell and prepare the notification out to the public. So all this cyber event, it happens every day in different companies. This was a benefit for them. Scott, I know that you see this every time when you're doing some type of the managed detection response. Can you give us insight on what you're looking at and how do you see it through your lens?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Keith. I think you said very well that obviously all things being equal, the whole goal is never to get to this position, but truth is that this does happen. And we've had many customers that come to Kroll. We're well known for incident response. We've had a lot of cases that, we're basically along this same theme. I think the thing that people overlook a lot is that knowing who you're really dealing with is of vital importance. So it's very difficult for any particular organization that's never undergone an incident like this. They never, they don't frequent, on the weekend, actor chat rooms or actor sites. So, it's like, okay, this note says this is so-and-so, they're making a demand, they're making a claim. How legitimate do we take it? Because sometimes it can actually be, I'll drop a spoiler alert, but criminals lie. So sometimes, they'll say they've got data that they don't have, or they'll make claims that they can't actually back up. So, sometimes it'll say this is Lockbit. Well, we know there's been so much upheaval in certain actor groups that you could be dealing with the Lockbit of today, the Lockbit of 6 months ago. Like these could be very different groups with different objectives. And really, we've had situations too where it was very clear from prior dealings that certain groups were not able to make good on, the claim to be able to provide a decryptor. So even if somebody were to pay the ransom, we could already tell them in advance, you're not going to get what you think you're going to get by paying the ransom. This is a fly-by-night kind of operation. Sometimes the data, like say exactly what is found in the data, they're always going to say on the claim site, we've got all your sensitive data, we've got all your intellectual property. We've had a case that was very similar to this one where the claim was, 50 gigabytes of data of intellectual property. After actually obtaining that data, it turned out that it was 4+ years old data, and it was all basically in the open source and known anyway. So there was no, real risk there. So although it's still an incident to be dealt with, it's a problem to be solved. It turns out not all of these are of an equal impact, and knowing, what's real and what's not real is crucial.
Yeah. And by the way, I took note of that. Criminals do not lie. Perfect. That's awesome. Yeah, and exactly. So it's very beneficial for something like this to have on hand. So I'm going to give you one more case example that we have. So there was a professional services client. It was a large organization with a lot of employees looking for an ongoing and proactive visibility into their exposure and risk from activity in the dark web, criminal network, just anywhere. Wanted to see what existed. So as we collected some of the information needed to conduct the research and analysis, like I said earlier, we take the approach of a threat actor with our experience and backgrounds. We are well aware of how they act, per se. And we identified a post on a forum that a threat actor offered corporate access to dozens of entities to include the client. And it was described as a VPN, virtual machine, or RDP account. Now, we looked further and confirmed through sources that this was the client we had, and it was active. The account was active, was live. We immediately notified our client and with the findings and provided them with screenshots, details of the access, what was going on. Then we created an attribution sheet and a summary of the threat actor's activity and reputation, not only for this forum, but others as well throughout the channels. And that's very, very important. And we can get that into another topic another time. But reputation is key to all of this too. So as we did that, with the alert for the access of sale, the attribution package, the potential indicators of compromise associated with this actor, we provided the client the benefit of the visibility of the dark web and the forum activity. Additionally, we gave the client mitigation steps to help solidify any gaps that they had that was associated with this attack. We have as Ben talked earlier, we have the entire entity when it comes to services for Kroll from start to finish, and we work with those teams in order to identify and understand what those mitigation strategies are. So with that, we're able to provide them actionable things they can do to help protect themselves. Now, I know, Scott, I know you see this all the time, I'm sure, with RDP access, all these different types of access. I mean, how vulnerable are people, but what do you see in that really sticks out with you with this type of attack?
Yeah, this is, basically the doomsday scenario for, being in internal SOC operations and being in an NDR operation, that when an actor has valid credentials and just sails straight in through a VPN or an RDP, that kind of feels like comes out of nowhere type of attack, right? Because it's in that situation, there's possible indicators, sometimes there's things you can be looking at as far as the anomalous nature of a login or the GeoIP, but, there's certainly ways of getting around all those things. So that's, so many cases that we've worked over the years, the first indicators seem to be, in retrospectively looking at an investigation, somebody just logged in using an administrator account and straight over VPN, no two-factor authentication. At some point down the attack chain, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, something finally does trigger, hey, a malicious tool being used or a lateral movement alert or something that, starts to indicate like this is not just a legitimate access. But sometimes the speed of those is so quick. If somebody has legitimate credentials, regardless from where they got them, you may never know how those credentials were obtained in the first place. Some prior operation, some prior phishing, some leak site, all the leaks that have occurred over the years. People reuse passwords. It just makes it so simple. So yeah, sometimes it's really measured in minutes where a VPN login occurs. Somebody's got high level access on a box. They're dropping ransomware within a couple of minutes, where they're setting up their exfiltration out on Dropbox or out to something. So yeah, that's where we find you're almost sort of compelled these days not to rely only on detection. And we kind of have a famous saying in security of prevention is ideal, detection is a must. But if there's something that really can't be even in principle detected until the worst harm has been done, then you've got to think, okay, how do we get slightly upstream from this? We can't just wait for the anomalous login to happen, wait for the clearest signs of malicious behavior, because by then it really is too late.
Yeah, I like I said, because I think if anyone takes anything away from this, one of the biggest things is the most critical part of any type of investigation or cyber attack is the determination between detection and response. You want to minimize that as much as possible. I think that is the key to everything, really, when it comes down to it. That's why you're doing all this stuff. That's why you're maturing yourself, because hopefully you won't ever get attacked, right? But if you do, that timetable needs to be so short that you're able to just stop it. And I think that's an awesome point. Okay, so how does it work? How does Kroll? Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm going. Scott, this come over to you now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, we'll get back to the how does it work part, but yeah, just going to expound a little bit more. I think Ethan already introduced this as a concept. We'll just get into a little more detail of, from the defender's perspective, we're always trying to figure out, what are the things that are most important for me to be looking for and detecting on. Most of that is what we would call during compromised behavior, and that's where, I'll get to the MITRE attack matrix here in a minute. Now, this is another taxonomy that we use within Kroll just to kind of expound a little bit more on some of the phases that are happening in that kind of center column there. When an attack is kind of in progress. So, this kind of assumes an exploitation has been successful. There are several fairly common steps that happen next within that. And, I think we've gotten a lot better at, probably 5-10 years ago. So much of what was happening even during a compromise was going unregarded because of, lack of visibility, lack of tooling. Teams didn't have good detection methods, even if they had the tooling. I think that's all come a long way. So that's, really kind of covering your internal attack surface is job number one for most companies, or you have to take care of what's going on within your own four walls. Usually where people start to pick up, the most likely, the farther you get down the attack chain, from that initial exploit down to, moving laterally and executing mission, the probability of detection increases. However, the probability of harm also increases. So, everybody's trying to figure out ways like, hey, how can we get closer to the point of entry, pick up on some of that internal scouting or reconnaissance, see when tools are being deployed. So those are all, tasks that are always going to be, part of that cat and mouse game. That, actors will find better ways to live off the land. They'll find ways to blend in. How do you, tool your detections and your visibility to catch those things? And that's where obviously the threat intelligence that we derive, from either, third parties or internally is what we use to create new internal monitoring use cases. So all the SIEM rules, EDR rules, everything that goes into the SOC really comes from that observation and knowledge. What kind of ends up being on the outside of that, you kind of see on the diagram here, is we've kind of bracketed for most situations that we don't know what the actors are doing behind the scenes, right? And there's been very little capability of, you can kind of guess or kind of assume, what's going on to do reconnaissance and develop resources, meaning how are credentials being gathered, how are domains being stood up, what should we be looking at? And some of these things really cross over the same lines of, you do certain things to protect your brand, like we look for typo squatted domains, we look for things that could be used even just, maybe not even from a malicious actor perspective, but from a brand infringement perspective. Example of one that we had not too long ago was somebody had registered Kroll11.com. So Kroll, Kroll.com. If you type these into your browser, they look about the same, right? This is one of those typo squatting techniques that people use. So that, initial information may not be immediately actionable. You're like, we don't know why somebody is registering Kroll11.com. Chances are it's not good. And, that one did end up being, a interesting story. But, seeing before compromises happened, what resources are being built up. Can you get notifications more quickly from, rather than waiting for it to show up on haveibeenpwned.com or showing up on Brian Krebs' site, well-known journalist who breaks a lot of stories. You have better ways of getting early warning that you need to pick up on that side of the attack chain. And then kind of after compromise, again, it's the area that people don't like to think about a lot. I think we put so much emphasis into prevention and detection that we kind of just close our eyes and hope that there will never be an after compromise scenario, but these are things that also have to be prepared for. So seeing, especially, and sometimes there are repetitious extortions that can be made. And I've seen a bunch of these keys where there have been a real incident in a company's environment. Say, a year ago, they had a data exfiltration event, data was stolen. That may not, whatever was done to resolve that the first time around may come up again in the future, right? So there may be another attempted re-extortion. Somebody can come back and say, hey, we saw, out on one of these ransomware shaming sites, these blog sites, company's name shows up there. Others may be, again, criminals tend to be unscrupulous, crazy thought, I know, but will pick up on something like that and say, hey, you had data leakage. We have your data now too. I don't care if you paid ransom or extortion to someone else, like we're also going to release your data. So, there are many things that happen sort of outside of the visibility from in your network to beyond the point of extortion that really you're doing something like digital risk protection is the only way to get at that. Next slide. We'll just talk a little bit about how this, basically what I've described here is another way of thinking of the MITRE attack matrix. I'm sure people are very familiar with this, but the attack matrix is basically a way to describe, high level tactics that are going to be used. And, there's a whole row of techniques that go down each one of those. What we've done here is kind of just shown everything that's usually part of an intrusion lifecycle kind of falls into the middle of the matrix. And then again, on the outer ends, you've got the reconnaissance, resource development, impact side. And it's surprising how many of these, can be well covered or at least gestured at, with doing digital risk protection. Again, we're never going to know 100% of what actors are thinking or doing. They have closed doors that we can't always get behind, but surprising to me actually how brazen sometimes the forums and things can be. Like once you get that sort of trusted position in the chat rooms or in the forums, how they could speak very openly of what they've obtained. I think we had an interesting example not too many weeks ago where the Screen Connect compromise was published, and within minutes and hours, POCs are released. There's chatter about this. There's lists of they're faster than sometimes the defenders are at getting a list of entities that could be compromised by a particular CVE. So again, the reconnaissance side is actors are looking for easy victims. They're looking for low-hanging fruit. Obviously the CVE of the week, I call it, is where they often start. So, they're kind of expecting, it's not as common anymore to have something that's been unpatched since 2019. Of course, that stuff still happens, but when something new comes out that really is a 0-day or has been a very short notification period, 1 day, 2 day, 3 days, it gives actors a lot of time to tool up and conduct campaigns. So they're always kind of thinking one step ahead. Okay, like if I were able to get access into a certain environment, what would the next steps be? As soon as the opportunity comes to get into that environment, then away they go. The second column there, resource development. So credentials are king, right? There's always, first step is getting some kind of credential that at least gives an initial foothold. Very commonly, the next step is acquire more credentials, like create another backdoor account, dump, all the domain credentials, have kind of an insurance policy because actors know, hey, when I've used an account for the first initial access, it may be burned. I can't use that indefinitely. I'm going to need some kind of a fallback in the form of more credentials. Let me kind of just skip over, like all the things that happen in the middle. SOC monitoring would be, the lateral movement that occurs, exploitation, further discovery of the network, and then all the way through to impact. This is an area, again, of the MITRE matrix I think gets overlooked quite a bit because, again, it's possibly wishful thinking or hoping that there's nothing that we could do, like we don't have any tools to prevent, financial theft if we should get to that point. We don't know how we would even, pick up on a data manipulation or defacement situation. But this is typically how, you find out is this either gets published in the news somewhere like, hey, that was a defacement, or a Twitter account was taken over. And I think being able to contextualize those, thinking about what it would mean, again, everybody's worried that if their name shows up in the news or shows up with something saying, hey, so-and-so company's account was taken over, you can kind of remember there are much different grades of being compromised from, the very simple, somebody's Twitter password was leaked and now they can put disparaging stuff on your Twitter feed. That's not a good look. It's definitely bad PR, but it's not the same thing as somebody has your domain administrator's account and you have an open RDP and now they're inside your network. So I think what this often just gives is ability to make better decisions about, okay, how worrisome is this particular finding? Is this a credible threat? What's the likely outcome of this going to be? Is this financially motivated? Is this more higher order where it's actually after data and persistence that may continue for months or years? So again, it's kind of the overall concept is we just want to find ways, this is from famous movie hackers, sorry for those who haven't seen it, but snoop onto them as they snoop onto us. So we want to know if we can find anything they're saying that's like, hey, I just got access to so-and-so hospital. Sometimes I'll even ask the most inane questions like, what do I do next? It's like, well, if you see that, then we've got a problem. We can respond before that question actually gets answered. So this plays out in a lot of interesting ways. It's quite the interesting underworld to see the chatter and the discussions that go on. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So just to bring it together, again, I've mentioned about what we're looking for from a defense perspective is obviously we want to reduce our attack surface, whether it's internal or external. Where I think the industry is really going lately is thinking quite a bit more about that outside looking in view. So my external attack surface has kind of become a whole new niche in the industry. There's a lot of companies and products built up specifically around this. And it is essentially an extension, like Keith was saying, like the term threat intelligence is a big umbrella term and used in a lot of ways. But understanding external attack surface is another manifestation or growth, I think, in that discipline. So for the most part, your internal exposure is managed through the traditional ways that we've had for many years, having proper visibility, having proper coverage of endpoints, cloud, identity. These are all areas that people have to grow into over the years, kind of expanding out your holistic threat exposure management. But then that outside looking in view is this exactly what we've been talking about, that people are creating domains, they're picking up credentials, they're looking into social media to find out, soft targets, technologies that you use. I always cringe when we put out, some very detailed job postings on things like social media that describe in detail, like every tool and technology that person would need to know, but it also is tipping an attacker like, hey, if I want to get into this organization, I need to figure out some kind of exploit against the tools and technologies that are being mentioned there. So again, that external exposure doesn't get as much time or attention, but we do find that as much as anything is going to shore up a defense program, more so probably than adding on another blinking box under the network rack. These things all have their place. But if you don't know how your organization looks from the outside, you can spend a lot of time on investments you don't need. You can be swayed by sort of spurious claims about what's going to happen if you don't invest in some of these things. The truth is that, like Keith was saying, attacks start from somewhere, and that's usually starting from some external vantage point. So yes, they'll try to get inside the network as soon as possible, set up a beachhead, expand from there. But the goal is to both look at internal and external, make sure that you're not weighting too heavily on one or the other, because they are both part of a successful defense program. All right, let's go ahead and move on. I think, Keith, we're going to pass it back over to you. So talking a little bit, we've talked about in concept, what are the things that successful defense programs need to do? And we can talk a little bit more about how Kroll's view is on this and how our program works.
Yeah, and like you said, you got to take that view of how it's going to fit within your program for sure, and how it works at Kroll. So, with the way we look at it, we go back to the beginning. We need to establish a vision of what each client wants, including like the risk appetite and what we want monitored, if they monitor, what we're trying to get out of the service. along with the experience and expertise of the Kroll team. So what we do is we begin collecting and reviewing all the data. The data is collected through our strategic partnerships and Kroll, and cross-correlated with Kroll's own proprietary data, which includes intelligence from our thousands of ongoing incident response cases, cyber assessments, red teaming exercises, and our current MDR plans. All of that gets put into one. And then, which is, I believe this is the most important phase, and I talked about this earlier, is the investigation itself. The third stage here, which you see, the human analysis and verification. Now, this is where the intelligence is derived from. Everything else up to this point is just information. Once the actionable and enriched data is identified and valuable to you or the client, that's when the reporting phase begins. But you need to identify what's valuable. Now, we set up rules of engagement. They start at the start of any type of matter, and that carries over through for alerting and through reporting phases. So during this, there are several reporting features, as you can see here in the far right, that we offer. So going back to the beginning, though, the key is answering those 5 questions. As you're looking at the reporting, again, why am I alerting on this? Is this pertinent to our goal? What does this mean to me? Why should I care about this? And what can I do to mitigate? Right? These are the questions you need to answer for any DRP you set up. If you can answer those questions, it's going to be a great alert. It's going to take you further. You can make better and informed decisions on what you need to do going forward. Next slide. Okay, so I think we're going to get to key takeaways with Ben.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks for your questions as well. We'll get to those in a minute. So we've covered a few different areas, and I just wanted to try to summarize, Keith and Scott, what you've taken us through. So key takeaways that I've certainly taken away is, firstly, mapping out exposures of both internal and external attack surface. Clearly we touched on maybe SOC teams, or if you've got internal security staff who are maybe security analysts and they're looking at monitoring their endpoints, they're maybe using SIEM technology to monitor the network devices, or if they've got some kind of cloud security monitoring in place as well. You've got your internal attack surface covered. But how about where there's exposures on the dark web, or if there are credentials that are being pasted on specific dark websites that are behind paywall, or require specific Tor browser to be able to access? Yes, some of these sites are being taken down, but then they're constantly being spun up again, and attackers are constantly finding new ways to expose this kind of information. So how do you get ahead of the trend? And we covered a little bit about to have that holistic threat exposure management capability. Make sure you're covering both bases in terms of your internal security monitoring and your external security monitoring. And the second key takeaway really here was the ability to leverage a solution like digital risk protection services to be able to address that external detection and response capability, especially around augmenting any internal security monitoring that you're doing. You can then extend that detection or that visibility in terms of being able to monitor the surface web, such as social media sites, blog sites, any kind of external facing and open sourced area of the internet, the deep web as well. So things like either paywall or where you may need specific credentials to be able to access, or that are unindexed and can't be searched through a traditional search engine, but also the dark web areas maybe where there's private chat channels that you can't typically access, or ransomware shaming sites, page sites, things like that. But also in terms of the response efforts. So yes, traditionally, if you're looking at maybe outsourcing your SOC capabilities to an MDR provider, they can help you to do detection and the response internally to contain a threat, block a threat, whatever it may be. But how about externally? What sort of response actions can you take? And really with digital risk protection capabilities, that's where you can utilize things like takedown services to be able to remove any spoof domains and remove any malicious content that may be on social media or on any internet-facing platforms. And then thirdly, we've talked a little bit about how we typically deliver our services, including managed detection response services to our clients, but also how our clients are seeing the benefit and the value of including digital risk protection to make sure they've got that holistic threat exposure management capability as well. So we definitely encourage anyone who's looking into these services to have a chat with us, have a chat with Keith and Scott, reach out to us to talk a little bit about it and what your approach is, what you're thinking, and we could certainly help to address that. Right, I think we'll turn over to questions now before we close. I can see we've got a few more minutes. But a lot of questions which I think have been addressed within the chat themselves. There were some which were posted anonymously, and I'll just read some of those out. So I think I'll direct this question to you, Keith. What type of response can you take when identifying things like spoof domain? I guess that question could be driven by a use case of perhaps they've got a domain which has been copied, or domain that's been compromised, and maybe I guess this can be used in phishing campaigns, targeting their clients or suppliers, or even their own employees. So, well, what sort of actions can a digital risk protection solution take in order to eradicate this? I think you may be on mute, Keith.
Yeah, I'm a pro and I'm not muted. And so sorry about that. Yeah. So the biggest thing with this is, looking at brand monitoring, domain monitoring. So there's all kinds of domains, subdomains. If you find someone that's typo squatting, spoofing, phishing, you want to make sure that gets taken down immediately. So we monitor for it. So Kroll monitors for it. And then we have an SLA of 10 hours. Obviously, if the domain is malicious and the terms and conditions of that provider are something where they're not able to, or we're able to take it down, we take it down guaranteed within 10 hours. But another aspect of that is, if you're monitoring for it on the deep and dark web as well, or even the chat platforms, the whole DRP solution, you can see if it's being used elsewhere too. Not just, okay, this domain is phishing, but what's the context of it within the environment, right? You're doing research on all of these different forums, chat platforms, and understanding, okay, it's being used for X, Y, and Z. Maybe it's being used to deliver malware. How do we do that? How do we combat that? So there's more than just the monitoring on the top heavy, but getting down and doing the investigation is very beneficial too.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit on that one. Even before I really worked with Kroll, you kind of start to create quite a Rolodex of hosting providers and registrars, and because it ends up being some form of approaching their abuse department, like, hey, this is an abuse of trademark, this is an abuse of our brand name. Some of them are much more responsive than others, and like you said, you kind of have to create eventually some kind of trust and relationship with all these, because 1 week it's GoDaddy, the next week it's the main registrar somewhere else. They are not all equally responsive, and there are some that live in bulletproof hosting where the whole point is that they are not responsive to things like legitimate complaints. So there's a wide spectrum there, but usually, most providers want to be helpful. They recognize that the harm that can be done, this has been going on for long enough that usually there's some kind of an inroad, but you may get put into a faceless queue for a while, before you get in front of somebody who can really take action about the takedown.
Agreed.
Thanks. Next question. We currently get threat intel from specific mainstream intel sharing communities and open source. What other sources of intel do we need? I think this is referring to if they're already getting, or they're already using open source information to get some of this intel. How can a digital risk protection or a managed DRP service like this help? What sort of elements does this add on top of that? So I mean, possibly G, Keith. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll start, and Scott, I think you could add to this too. But the biggest thing, so the open source intel you should get, right? If you're feeding that directly into your SIEM or your firewall, it's vital, right? You need that because it's confirmed stuff through the ISACs or wherever it is. But the stuff that you're going to get from specific companies, like I said earlier, 2% overlap, you need to determine what your risk appetite is. From there, okay, how is this going to affect me, and what do I need to do to protect it? So and I can always speak of Kroll because that's where I'm at now, but we're having these incident response cases going on 24/7, right? We have 3,000 plus incident response cases a year. With that, we always collect IOCs, or indicators of compromise, TTPs, and if we collect it at 2:00 on Monday, within 24 hours, we're looking to have that verified, pushed up to our feed so it's protected, and we've seen protection up to 10 days earlier than anybody else. And that's because it's live, right? We're seeing these attackers live and investigating live. So it's really important to speed, so you can, in that gap, like I said, detection and response, can you minimize that? That's what you're looking for. In those 10 days, will you be attacked? I don't know, right? So looking at these feeds, you want to make sure that you have the most up-to-date and effective feeds that you need to protect yourself. But Scott, you're seeing this all the time with different types of threat intel feeds too.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give, an obviously biased answer, but I'm much more a fan of quality over quantity when it comes to threat intelligence and subscriptions. I think there can be a certain tendency in this industry to kind of really focus in on, like, if I don't have 10 gazillion indicators, I'm not doing my job, and it's like most of those are not going to be high value. It's kind of like if you ask a generic question, you get a generic answer. So things that are in the open source, they're usually outdated. They tend to be more indicative of false positives over time than anything that would be useful to most organizations. So again, it could be Kroll, and there's plenty of providers out there, but I think finding vendors that are very close to current threat landscape, so marketplaces and kind of distributors, that's one way to go. If you can get it for free or for cheap, then no harm, no foul, as long as it's not overburdening your teams. But I think finding one or two primo trusted sources, again, there's a whole spectrum out there. Try the results that you get. I think most of these have a subscription or a trial period. Give it the 30-day or the 60-day, give it some time to see if and when I get hits off of this intelligence, has it actually helped me in any way, or is it just adding to my burden, or it's low fidelity when it does happen. So yeah, start, most people, as they do, start with the free, consider expanding into the nearest areas of your industry, verticals. I love the ISACs. I love, people will talk a little more freely amongst friends, the other peers, and they sometimes will, out to the open world. And then, maybe just one or two commercial sources, don't go bananas on that side, because it's one of those where you can really overspend, and it's really quite unnecessary.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, literally, the final question here, which submitted privately, was around the investment. I guess this is more of you, Scott. Is digital risk protection worth the investment if we're already outsourcing our MDR service?
Yeah, I think that's really our position in recent years, that we never can have an end all be all of any service that exists. So MDR, I think, is crucial. I think if you don't have one, go get one. I think most companies could use the augmentation and the skills that come with that. So MDR is a piece of it. It does tend to be more asset aware. So like, these are the assets we have. This is how we're monitoring them. Cloud, shadow IT. You try to get arms around all those kinds of things. But the DRP really is coming at this from a different angle. It's more of thinking like the attacker, thinking as an outsider. Yes, we try to patch all the things and have the perimeter as strong as possible. It's very difficult to always stay on top of all the things all the time. So having that prioritization does become an input into your overall security posture. And yeah, there's no single solution that's going to do all that. MDR included, much as I love it.
It's true.
Thanks, Scott. Well, I think we've sadly run out of time for today, but just want to give a big thank you to everyone who has taken the time to tune in. We hope you found this session useful and informative. We always enjoy doing these kind of sessions and trying to share our knowledge as well. If you want more details of this particular topic we've outlined today, then please do reach out to us. When you leave the briefing, you'll be directed to a short survey. So if you could spare a few moments, we'd greatly appreciate if you could tell us your thoughts on the session, as this really helps us prepare for future sessions as well, making sure it's useful for everyone who's attending. But yeah, with that, once again, thanks a lot for joining us today. Thank you, Keith and Scott, for your time. And yeah, everyone enjoy the rest of your day. We hope to see you again at one of our future briefings.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ben. See you, Keith.
Take care.